It was a great big, huge tower block that went up on fire, and within minutes, the entire thing was an inferno.
To take away our justice, which is all we have, to take that away means we have been robbed of their lives. They have been robbed of their lives.
The inquiry report is almost an irrelevance to them. They want people behind bars. Everyone knew who was responsible.
It was this country's worst residential fire since the Second World War, Grenfell, where 72 people died. The final report into the tragedy is set to be released, examining how the London tower block caught fire so quickly. The inquiry was first commissioned by Theresa May back in 2017, just a day after the fire broke out on June the 14th. It has been 7 years in the making. A police investigation is still ongoing, and that means the bereaved and survivors of Grenfell Tower will have to wait until at least 2027 before anyone is put on trial. Is this what justice looks like? Ahead of the inquiry's report, our chief reporter, Rob Mendick, has been speaking to survivors to hear what they think. Are they happy with this inquiry? What do they want from the upcoming report? And crucially, who do they think is to blame for one of the UK's worst modern disasters? Welcome to this special Daily Tea episode with me, Kamal Ahmed, and our chief reporter, Rob Mendick. And a warning that some listeners may find details in this podcast distressing.
Fire brigade?
Yeah, hello. Hi, in the fire, flat 16 Grenfell Tower.
Sorry, a fire where?
Flat 16 Grenfell Tower.
The fire brigade are on their way. Are you outside?
Yeah, I'm outside.
Yeah, well, the fire engines are on their way. Just tell me how many floors you got there.
It's the fourth floor.
Right,
All
okay.
right, quick.
They're on their
It's
way
burning.
already.
Rob, take us back to the night of the Grenfell fire.
Just before 1 a.m, so early hours of the 14th of June, 2017, the first 999 call comes in about a fire in a high-rise block in North Kensington, West London. We'll come to know this as Grenfell Tower. Of course, call handlers get inundated then with calls. By 1:15 a.m, the fire's climbing up the outside of the building. By 2:06 a.m, London Fire Brigade had declared this fire a major incident. Crowds of people had gathered beneath. By 3 a.m, most of the building was covered in flames. And yet the stay put policy doesn't get withdrawn until, I think, 2:47 in the morning. Residents were soon trapped in their homes. 70 people died like that in the flats. 2 more would die later in hospitals succumbing to their injuries. I think the figure is something like 85% of those who died in there were from ethnic minorities. Another 70 people were injured, and a total of 223 people managed to escape the tower block.
Quite incredible numbers, Rob, and to be reminded of the horror of that night. But those, of course, are just numbers. What was actually happening inside the building through that time?
I mean, I've covered this story for some years now, and I've spoken to people for this podcast, and I've spoken to people in the past, and the stories are horrific. Flora and Hisam, you're about to hear from, lived on the top floor of the Grenfell Tower with her husband, Sabah, and their son, Farhad. Flora and Farhad survived the fire. Everyone else on the top floor, including Sabah, her husband, died that night.
When I saw people was shouting, screaming, and I was seeing the reflection of the fire and the window of the school. There was in front of me. I told my husband there is something wrong, there is a fire, and he awake and still he didn't believe anything, and he said there's fire, and Farhad was trying to find out what is wrong. I said we have to go downstairs and see what happened. My husband said you shouldn't go. He didn't want us to go. My son was asking that please come, we have to be together. If we go downstairs or if we stay, we have to be together. And he was going to my bedroom to check, and he came and he said, I can see the fire. The fire arrived in our bedroom. You shouldn't open the room. I said, let's go, please, because if the fire come out, it is block our outdoor. We can't arrive. We are stuck. And when we got out from our flat, the lobby was clear. It's just only little bit smoke. And three of us came out from the flat, and I didn't want myself personally, I didn't want to burn. I was decided to jump from my window, and my husband said, don't be silly. They said, the fire brigade said, we are coming and rescue. They are coming. And they didn't come. We went inside the smoke, and I thought my husband is behind me. And when we used the stairs, I called him. He didn't answer me. I told my son, he's not answering. He said, he's coming. I said, no, we have to go back. We have to go back and tell him to come. I was shouting, I was crying and loud screaming and call him. He's not answer. And we are using the staircase, and we couldn't see anything. And just feeling, we were shaking, and we couldn't breathe properly, and coughing, vomiting, and wasn't able to talk.
Meanwhile, Saba stayed behind in the flat to help some women who'd seek shelter there. He didn't want to leave and abandon them. Flora is very frail, fragile lady, even at the time. I mean, you can imagine what she's been through. Stuck on the top floor. Amazingly, her son Fahad was a British Taekwondo international. Strong lad. He picked her up, put her over his shoulder, and began the extraordinary descent down the stairs from the top floor to the bottom, rescuing his mum.
And he was using the wall to keep himself. That was very difficult for him. We were going down, and suddenly I saw someone took from my wrist, and Farhad said, Mom, this is fire brigade. It was impossible to see them because of the smoke, but they had the oxygen. At that time I couldn't breathe properly. I was nearly to fall down, and they sat us close to the tower, and I was watching. The fire was arrived around the living room and the kitchen, and I was crying. I was calling my husband. Her phone is ringing, but he is not answering.
Flora ended up in a coma, not knowing what had happened to her husband. It's only when she awoke that she was told he'd left a voicemail message for his family before he jumped from the top floor of the tower to his death, preferring that to burning to death. The message left in their native Farsi, I think it was. I've got a translation of it. Goodbye. We are now leaving this world. Goodbye. I hope I haven't disappointed you. Goodbye to all.
He died, he buried, and my life has been changed. Every week I'm going to his grave, and even when I'm going to his grave, I'm not accepted his grave. I feel he's alive. I miss him a lot. Miss him because he wasn't only my husband. He was really good friend for me.
Beautiful words there from Flora, and also how harrowing the events of the night were, and also the events subsequently.
And it clearly isn't just those who escaped the building and survived on that who were traumatised. We're talking a lot of people went to the building and watched it burn, and that includes people whose relatives were in there. I also spoke to Hisam Shukair, and he lost 6 members of his family in the fire. That's the biggest single loss of any family. Half his family basically wiped out in one night. That was his mother, Syria, his sister, Nadia, and her husband, Bassem, and then their 3 young daughters, Myrna, Fatima, and Zainab, who was just 3 years old. Spoken to Hisam. He's in pieces still, 7 years on. This is his story of that night.
So I received a call roughly from about 2:25, 2:35. I can't remember the exact time, from my brother. And it was one of those calls where the phone would just ring, and I knew something wasn't right. So when I called my brother back, he told me that, the tower was on fire. And I immediately put on the TV, and I saw the building was just engulfed in flames. And I immediately shouted to my wife, to wake up the children and get them ready. And my children were quite young, and we put them in a buggy. I don't even know if they were wearing shoes. We were in that much of a rush. And I just ran to the scene, and it was a hot, humid day during the month of Ramadan, and I think we arrived at the scene at 3:00, and I could hear like a helicopter in the sky. I then started calling my mother, my sister, and nobody was answering, but the phone was just ringing. And I knew that they were in danger, having seen the scene on the TV already. There was no way that they were getting out of that fire, because the flames were wrapped up around the tower, like swallowing it, if you know what I mean, from all different angles. And I saw people scattered all over the streets, screaming. The police were telling us to get back, raising their voices. There was a lot of hostility, and you could sense the panic that was going on, and I could hear pieces of the cladding falling from the building. It would cause like a burning sensation in our eyes. We knew that my mother, Syria, who's disabled, would be in the flat with Nadia, her husband Bassem, and her 3 children, Myrna, who was roughly about, back then I think she was about 14, Fatima was about 11 I think at that time, and Zainab, who was only 3 years old.
The family was found in the flat, in a circle, holding hands, is that right?
That's what I was told. They formed a barrier, if you know what I mean, in the corner to protect the children from the fire.
How much do you miss your mum, sister, nieces, brother-in-law?
Words cannot describe that. They mean the world to us. Life is so empty without them. There's not a day, not a minute that goes by where the thought of them, the memories of them, it's too painful to describe. We have been robbed of their lives. They have been robbed of their lives.
I remember the day after so vividly. Obviously, as a journalist, we were covering the story. I was working at the BBC at the time, and immediately, not only the scale of the disaster, but the question started is, how could such a horror unfold so quickly? This idea of the flames starting in one flat and the whole tower becoming an inferno so rapidly. What did we immediately find out about what had happened, Rob?
Things became clear actually quite quickly. We discovered quite early on the source of the fire, which is obviously the starting point of this, is there has to be a fire in the first place. In this case, it was a hot point fridge freezer in flat 16 on the 4th floor. Fridge fires actually are pretty common. It's not that unusual. It happens. Fire brigades get called out, they put fires out. The problem here is it's a high-rise tower block that's been refurbished badly, and it's been refurbished with aluminium composite material cladding. This stuff, as we now know, and we're all about to be reminded of in the final report, is highly combustible. So you're taking a very high building, 24 floors in the case of Grenfell, and you're sticking on the outside of it combustible, highly combustible cladding that at the top of the tower, fire brigade ladders can't reach. You would then think, fine, a fire has broken out, let's get everyone out of the building. That seems obvious to me and you. But the fire brigade had this stay put policy. The very immediate thing is the fire brigade and the controllers in the 999 rooms are telling residents, don't leave the building, stay put. And if you did that, that was pretty close to a death sentence. The fire should be contained in that flat. That's when stay put works. In this case, by 1:30 in the morning, it's at the top of the building already, flames on one side of the building. You can see the flames. There's videos of it. There's photographs of it. It's clear as day. So the stay put policy in the very first place is problematic. But it's the thing that causes this thing to become an inferno. It's the cladding. It's the refurbishment. There will be other things that the report will be looking at, which will include things like, were the fire doors right? Was there problems with the insulation material behind the cladding? Was the cladding fitted properly? Were there problems with the windows? Was there a general problem with the refurbishment? Was it done on the cheap? Were corners cut? These are all the things that the inquiry will be looking at. And these are all the things we've looked at already. And a lot of this has been aired in the press, of course. The government was well aware of problems with aluminium combustible material cladding. It had warnings for many years before it was used on Grenfell. The head of the London Fire Brigade said they never expected a Grenfell. They thought it was akin to, and the phrase they used was extraordinary, was akin to a flying saucer landing on the top of the Shard. That wasn't going to happen. In fact, the opposite. Cladding fires were fairly common. They happened quite a bit, and no one had seemed to see that coming. Yet, despite the fact that even a day later, on June the 15th, much of this was already becoming clear, and that the warnings were already been out there, Theresa May did that knee-jerk thing that prime ministers now seem to love to do, actually, and announced a public inquiry.
I know we've all heard absolutely heartbreaking, as I did this morning, heartbreaking stories of the people who were caught up in this terrible, terrible tragedy. And that's why I am today ordering a full public inquiry into this disaster. We need to know what happened. We owe that to the families, to the people who have lost loved ones, friends, and the homes in which they lived.
It's an inquiry that 7 years on has infuriated, angered, upset, caused distress amongst survivors and the bereaved.
I suppose, Rob, the announcement of a public inquiry sounds like the government is taking something seriously. So it's surprising that you're saying that the people so affected by this tragedy are angry by the fact that a public inquiry was announced. Why is that disconnect between public inquiry, that sounds serious, we need to find the truth, and how the bereaved and survivors have responded to it?
You would think public inquiry, that's absolutely the way to go. It's a big, complicated disaster, and it needs some answers, and it needs resolution for the future, not least. We need to know how to build these things going forward. I think that's fair. The problem is, in this case, it's very raw still. No one asked the survivors. No one asked Flora. She was in a coma. No one asked Hisam. He was looking for his relatives still on the ground. So there's a problem straight away in that you haven't asked, and you can't ask people on the ground, or many of the people on the ground who have most of the skin in the game, most of the interest in this, what they want. And anyway, they don't even know what a public inquiry is. They're not lawyers. They're not journalists. They've never seen a public inquiry. No public inquiry would ever have affected them. We've had public inquiries in the past that have been very effective, like the Bloody Sunday inquiry. Expensive, but they come many years after the original event. Hillsborough, very, very effective, but comes many years after the event, at a point at which there is nowhere else to turn, and the public inquiry is the right answer. The problem with Grenfell is it gets in the way of the thing that the bereaved really want, which is a criminal inquiry. Let's hear again from Hisam.
First thing I would like to say is we thank the inquiry for their findings when they do come out, and their efforts. But I think the most important thing of all that everyone needs to know is we did not ask for this inquiry. Our voices were robbed. We were not even given the choice of whether to have it or not. We didn't know the consequences, whether that would impact on justice moving forward, and neither was any of the direct kin families informed about an inquiry. There was no consultation from the government. I don't think we even had lawyers at that time. Impossible. I don't think anyone had a lawyer at that time, to be honest with you. Or even probably some people may have known what an inquiry was. Some people probably didn't know what an inquiry was and how this impacts them or their justice moving forward. We were taken advantage of. Our voices were robbed. There was an abusement of power from the government, and this simply can't happen again.
And in terms of just your own mental health, how's that been in the last 7 years?
I'm a completely different person. My mental health has been affected dramatically. I'm no longer able to do the things that I once enjoyed. I'm unable to go back to work. I feel I have no purpose in life. They have taken and rinsed every bit of resilience in me that was ever there, and they have just soaked me so dry that I'm like dust. They've taken so much energy out of me. Yeah, I just wish I could be the person who I was before.
Incredibly powerful from Hisam. Clearly, you have to assume that Theresa May didn't announce an inquiry malevolently to annoy those survivors and the bereaved. Why would Theresa May think an inquiry was the right thing to announce?
What an inquiry does is it takes the heat out of the government on day one of a disaster. She is under huge pressure, and at the time, if you remember it all, there was huge anger that the most impoverished people had perished in flames in a tower surrounded by multi-million-pound houses of people who were untouched. And I think, in part, Theresa May could see a potential for civil unrest, frankly. And there had been a march on the council offices of Royal Borough of Kensington Chelsea, which owned the tower block and which was ultimately responsible for its refurbishment. And I think that in the end, that's what this inquiry was about. It was about taking the steam out of the situation. And it's not an unreasonable thing to do in many ways, but it was putting the cart before the horse, I think, is what victims and survivors will say. Theresa May also was partial to an inquiry. She ordered a number during her stint as Prime Minister and as Home Secretary. But we're now going to hear from Kimia Zabihyan, who's a spokesman for a group called Grenfell Next of Kin, advocates for the bereaved, really. She represents around about half of those people who had family members killed in the fire. I asked her if it felt like justice had been denied.
Look, 100%, because actually the entire question over why the inquiry happened the way that it happened and who made that decision is really under a cloud of question marks. 24 hours after the fire, on the 14th of June 2017, Theresa May, who had only just won an election, it was a very chaotic period anyway politically, she announced the inquiry, that there was going to be a no stones unturned inquiry. That was just a day after the fire. No one even knew who was dead or alive or what had happened or what needed to happen. No one even knew or understood what an inquiry was. But because the inquiry was announced and was going to happen, it meant that the normal police investigations and the normal systems of justice, which is a crime happens and you find the suspects and you do your evidence gathering and you charge them, you go to the CPS, they make charging decisions, and then you go to court and you have your day in court in front of a judge and a jury. That was actually denied. So justice was denied. And the reason that people were given for why justice was denied is we must wait till the inquiry is over. But the question is, who decided that the inquiry was the route to justice? Who made that decision? Because the inquiry actually delayed justice, and not only that it delayed justice, but it has actually given the potential defendants a platform upon which they have been able to practice their defence.
I also spoke to Solicitor Imran Khan, who's representing some of the victims of Grenfell. He'll be familiar to a lot of you. Previously represented the family of Stephen Lawrence during the public inquiry into his murder, so he's very familiar with the process. He's a veteran of inquiries, in fact. And he said something that had dawned on him and that I thought was really interesting, that the inquiry itself, rather than benefiting the survivors necessarily, was, in his words, re-traumatising them.
It was remarkable for me when I was dealing with this case in particular, and almost embarrassed by this, but to find out that some of my clients that I've dealt with in Grenfell and other inquiries, other cases, not responding to my calls and emails about their case, and me feeling somehow that I'm doing all this work for them and they are not engaged, only to realise when I was reading some counselling reports for an individual involved in the Grenfell tragedy, is that every time I rang or sent an email, it re-traumatised them. I'm embarrassed and critical of myself that I didn't realise that these clients may not want to go to the inquiry, may not want to hear what happened, may not want to respond to my emails, may not want to be engaged, because these 7 years have been a daily reminder of what happened without closure. And that is, I think, the most heart-rending part of this case. So I'm perhaps being ultra-cynical here, and perhaps extremely cynical, but the use of inquiries now by politicians and those who should be held to be account is a means of, in my view, pretending there's change without there being any change. It's the idea that something's being done about it, but actually it's not giving closure to the victims of whatever miscarriage is involved. If my clients had known at the time that it would take that long, involve the kind of scrutiny or the lack of scrutiny that has occurred in some parts of what happened, I don't think any of them would have wanted a public inquiry. I said this to one of my clients, that the only people who have gained from this inquiry are the lawyers. And I'm part of that cohort. And I think I said words to that extent in my closing submissions to the inquiry, that a lot of this could have been avoided. I don't take any pride in that.
Quite an admission there, Rob, from Imran Khan, saying that the only people who have gained from this inquiry are the lawyers. It moves us on to the subject of money. Can you just talk us through how money has played a role in this inquiry and in the aftermath of the tragedy?
Yeah, of course. I mean, money doesn't bring anyone back, as every victim will tell you. Money isn't the answer. In the case of a public inquiry, it needs lawyers. You know, that's how it functions. It's a legal process. It's like a court. It has those powers. It needs people with the specialisms who know what they're doing. There's no criticism in that sense. That's just how the process works. But to put it in slight perspective, the inquiry to date has cost £170 million. It'll end up being more than that. In contrast, there has been a settlement already for the victims and the survivors and the bereaved. And that so far totals £150 million. So the inquiries cost £170 million. The victims, the bereaved, the survivors, the residents, have received a total of £150 million. That works out at around about £166,000 per claim. Now, some claims are still ongoing and behind the scenes. It's not the final story. But to put that in perspective, firefighters who attended the blaze on the night have also won damages. They're entitled to sue. They say their lives were put in jeopardy. They say that they were put under huge stress. They say that the fire brigade didn't equip them properly to go to the scene. They won £20 million in an out-of-court settlement. Now, the payouts for those firefighters range from somewhere between £10,000 to £1.1 million. And this is controversial because many of the survivors see the fire service, clearly not individual firefighters, but see the fire service, make that very clear, as responsible partly for the high number of deaths on the night. As we said before, if the London Fire Brigade had rescinded stay put straight away and evacuated the building, there is no doubt that many more lives would have been saved. So let's hear now from Kimia from Grenfell next of kin about that aspect.
It has been unbearable for those families. And I've witnessed it. I've sat there with them. I've heard their rage. So then you look at how much the firefighters have sued for compensation, which actually is something that has really upset the families because, You know, as I said, for them, the role of the fire brigade on the night is one of the most fundamental issues that they feel has not really been properly addressed and kind of gets skipped over, because the narrative is very much the firefighters are heroes. We can't criticize the firefighters. Well, sorry, we can criticize them. Then you've got the cost of the tower. Oh, it's going to be £340 million. Then you look at the cost of the inquiry. That's more than the compensation package. Then you look at, well, how much the lawyers have actually earned from this. That's bigger than their package. Then you look at the police investigation. That's bigger than the compensation package. As one of the families said, you know, it was a great lottery for people that my family all perished, because look at how much money is being made by all these other people. I'm not being paid, sitting here, going to meetings, talking to lawyers, whatever. But they are getting paid for, you know, my victimhood, if you like, is how they see it. I'm the victim here, but I'm literally working for free, but they're collecting money.
So in doing this podcast, one of the recurring themes was sort of anger, really, at the process and the legal process. And it also brought back memories for some of the victims of their claim that in the immediate aftermath of the fire, lawyers were flocking to the area, trying to sign up clients, knowing full well what was coming down the track. Let's listen again to Hisam.
I still recall it until today. I've never seen so many solicitors in my life hanging around this area trying to get people signed up, you know, trying to grab clients at the stage of where people were. Some people didn't have homes. Some people were looking for their families, and they were hanging around like leeches, you know, like vultures. And the government, or should I say the Justice Minister, allowed this to happen. We were vulnerable, and they allowed these people to sort of pick our flesh at the time of when we were vulnerable, and we were not protected by the state or the system, which is quite concerning. And there are lessons to be learnt moving forward.
Emotions completely understandably, Rob, still very raw. This report is the final report of the inquiry. What are we expecting? Is it going to settle so many of these outstanding issues that the survivors have and the people connected to the whole of Grenfell have been so generous in sharing with us?
It will be an amazingly thorough report. I think that's the first thing you should say. It won't leave a stone unturned. I can be certain of that. Sir Martin Woodward is an extremely eminent, capable lawyer with a brilliant mind that will unpick and untangle the absolute mess that was the cause of Grenfell. But in a funny way, of course, that's part of the problem too, because it'll be huge and it'll be difficult reading. I think I was told the executive summary alone will be something like 50 pages. It will run to thousands upon thousands, probably tens of thousands of pages, I wouldn't be surprised. The inquiry's looked at 300,000 odd documents. There's no criticism here of the inquiry itself. There's no criticism here of Sir Martin Woodward, who's chaired it. He's a brilliant, brilliant judge. He was a former Court of Appeal judge. He's the right man to do it. It's a very complex thing. He can move his way through it, and it takes time. But it's the taking time that has really caused the dismay and upset. In delaying the police investigation, we are kicking into the long grass, effectively, the thing that they really want to see, which is people put behind bars for what they see as this terrible, criminal, tragic act. So I think when this inquiry comes out, and it'll say, I suspect, all the things we expect it to say, which will be about the cladding, it'll be about the stay put we've had in the previous section, but it will unpick and unravel and untangle the mess of who caused the Grenfell problem, and it will look at what governments did in the past about red tape and so on and so forth. It will do all of those things brilliantly. I think it really will. But that's not what the bereaved need right now.
Will it bring resolution?
No. It depends a bit on who you speak to. Survivors will say one thing, others will say another. Government will apologise, it will take it all on board. Let's hear how Imran Khan summed that up.
I think if the report comes out in the way that I hope it will lay the blame at politicians. Lord Pickles was one who was scrutinised the inquiry, and what his department did or didn't do is going to be, I think, very much part of the inquiry report. What do we expect out of the public inquiry? Well, different things for different people. I think the lawyers will be expecting, or certainly I'll be expecting, a historical landmark inquiry which will hopefully change social housing in the UK and abroad, because the principles or the recommendations or the lessons are applicable not just to housing in this country but all over the world. There are high-rise blocks all over the world, and I suspect there's flammable, combustible material on many of those tower blocks. So from a purely legal perspective, the report, I hope, is far-reaching. I hope it'll be a damning indictment of those who were involved in putting the cladding on and responsibility for the fire. So that's what I hope, and I think, given the evidence, that's what I expect. I'm not sure whether my clients share that view, because like many people who are the victims of such tragedy, they say, well, we know what happened, we know who's responsible, but we don't need 7 years and thousands of words on pages to tell us what happened. So to some extent, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, that the inquiry report is almost an irrelevance to them. They want people behind bars. Everyone knew who was responsible. I mean, in fact, people were saying it in advance, that this was likely to happen if things didn't change. So from the survivor's point of view and the resident's point of view, they knew who was responsible.
So we know there's an ongoing police investigation, and it's unlikely that that's going to conclude until at least 2027. But lots of survivors already believe that they know who is responsible. Let's hear from Hisam again about who many of the survivors blame.
I would say the government would have to be number one, because every citizen living in this country, whether it may be social housing or private housing, has the right to live freely, safely, and should be protected from these barriers surrounding them in housing, through building regulations. There's a system put in there for a reason, and the government would be number one. The council I would hold next, because again, it's their responsibility, being the tenants, to lease these homes to make sure that they are safe. I would then say the London Fire Brigade, and then you've got the other companies. They wouldn't put their products in their own country, like America. You wouldn't even see their products. I mean, what does that say to you?
So the big question after this huge report is published, what is the next stage for the criminal investigation?
It's going to get complex. The police are going to have to pick up this report, and they're going to have to go through it line by line. They've got their parallel investigation. It's not like the police investigation has been sat there doing nothing. It's been doing a lot. So the police are ready to go in many respects, but they have to now look at this report, and it's going to be huge, and that's going to take a long time. And with the Crown Prosecution Service, the lawyers, the prosecutors, they're going to go through it line by line, and they're going to have to work out, can they charge people? What can they charge them with? Is it going to be health and safety? Is it going to be the much more serious corporate manslaughter? These are the things now that the police are going to have to look at. We're now going to hear again from Imran Khan.
This is not the end, as far as I'm concerned, from a legal perspective, the end of the process. This is the beginning of thinking about who was ultimately responsible and in what way. And what my clients are saying, well, look, if there's criminal prosecution, but there's also, what else can we do? Who else can we take action against? And I know the civil claim has been settled on the basis that the defendants have given a pot of money to those who are involved. But my clients are saying it's never been about the money. They want further action, because this is not just about those who were involved in the bricks and mortar of the tower, but about who put into place the process where Grenfell was allowed to happen. And that may be politicians, ministers. So it's certainly not the end of the story. This is the biggest tragedy of avoidable tragedy this country's ever seen. It was avoidable. And from the victims' and survivors' point of view, they wanted immediate justice and accountability.
Rob, first of all, amazing reporting from you and the team here on Grenfell, not only for this report, but also from the tragedy onwards. 2 or 3 big takeaways that you have, Rob, from this whole process that you've been involved in since that appalling night so many years ago.
I think one of the things that I take from it when I meet the victims who I've met before is just their remarkable resilience, actually, just their amazing bravery, courage. The horror is incredible. Their burden is incredible. And 7 years on, they're still fighting. And they haven't let that light dim. They're still fighting for justice. And they're still fighting for a terrible thing that happened on that night, never to happen again. And it is remarkable when you talk to them, Flora and to Hisam and others. I can't imagine the pain they've endured, and I can't imagine what they've gone through. And yet they're still willing to talk. They're still willing to talk openly. In the case of Flora, given the most detailed yet account of the night, her husband died. He was the light of her life. And so I kind of hope really that the inquiry hits home, and it will. But I really hope, and what I really want to see happen, and what they all want to see happen, is that now we've had the inquiry, that the recommendations are put in place, and that the government does what it does and makes sure that this never happens again.
Rob Mendick, thank you very much. This has been a special edition of the Daily Tea on the Grenfell fire. Do write to us with any thoughts on this special edition, the Daily Tea at telegraph.co.uk. Do visit the Telegraph, where we will be covering all the report's findings.